Well, good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Joseph Riccio, and I am the Associate Director and Director of Visitor Engagement at the Webdean Stevens Museum. Thank you all for being here today for Serving Up History. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, History Professor Rafaele Fierro. Rafaele will talk about James Madison's idea that in a large republic with lots of people, representative democracy could work because competing interests would cancel each other out. Now, in 2023, with 340 million Americans, can we keep our republic intact in the age of social media? Rafaele Fierro was born and raised in Hartford, the son of Italian immigrants. He attended Bulkley High School in Hartford, received his BA from Trinity College in 1992, and his doctorate in immigration history from the University of Connecticut in 2000. He was inspired to teach history while at Trinity by Professor Jack Chatfield. Rafaele is currently a professor of history at Tungus Community College in Farmington and has written numerous articles for the Encyclopedia of Connecticut History online. Welcome, Rafaele.
Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate the invitation and welcome to all of you. I hope you find the presentation helpful and instructive. What I'm going to do first is share the screen with you. So slideshow from the beginning. And here we go. So what I entitled the presentation is The America of Madison and Washington, because those two figures are prominent in the experiences of the early republic. But I do want to connect that past with our present and the present state of democracy. And what is the prospect of democracy in the 21st century, in 21st century America? So I start with this photo of James Madison. I have to explain to my students, by the way, this is not an actual photo. That, in fact, he never had an iPhone. They tend not to know these things sometimes. But it's a rendering of an artist who imagines Madison becoming alive in the 21st century, and he has tears welling up in his eyes. He's holding an iPhone and looking into it frighteningly. And this photo does speak a lot about where we are, not just in terms of social media, but in terms of our political culture in the 21st century. And so this photo will keep recurring here, just to give you a kind of reminder that, the state of democracy today is not the way it necessarily began. There's been an evolution of it, and some might even say a de-evolution of it. I also want to talk about other founders like Ben Franklin, and this also speaks to the main point I want to make, and that is that, keeping a republic requires a lot of hard work, and not just on the part of the political elite, but everyday people. There's a very well-known story of Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the participants, one of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And as the delegates had finished constructing the draft of the Constitution, had it ready for it to be sent to the states, Ben Franklin left Independence Hall, where most of the meetings took place, and he was kind of accosted by a group of people, one of whom was an elite woman, and she ran up to him excitedly and she asked, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And his very terse response was, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And I find the last clause of that statement very, very informative. If you can keep it. In other words, what he was saying in that very brief sentence is that it's up to us, it's up to each and every individual to restore, to keep the republic. And it's not easy work, and it requires that the generations that come and go fulfill their end of the bargain, their end of the promise. So there's a lot in that story. Back to Madison. I want to explain a little bit about who he is and how he's relevant to today's conversation on democracy. First of all, he was a rather diminutive man. He was physically small. He was about 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed no more than 110 pounds. But he was an intellectual giant, though he was the smallest president we've ever had. And he becomes known as the father of the Constitution for good reason. Many of the ideas that are embedded in the Constitution are his own. His imprint is all over that document, and I'll show you that in a minute. So what is ailing him in this picture? What is wrong with the current state of American democracy that would make him so scared? And even though this is a figment of an author's imagination, I think it poses some very real questions about where we are as a society. And more specifically, can his ideas provide a blueprint for us today? Are his ideas antiquated? Are they outdated? Or does he have relevance? I would argue he has a tremendous amount of relevance, and I hope to show you that today. So what are some of the founding principles that Madison and the others spoke about? Well, one of them is that republics are not guaranteed. They're highly experimental, and they do in fact require a lot of thoughtfulness and sober-mindedness and mutual respect and goodwill among Americans. And all of that together is contained in the word virtue. And if you look at the journals and letters of the founders, one of the things that they spoke often about is virtue. It was probably the most often used word in the political language of the day. So that's one of the founding principles. Virtue is a necessity. It's a prerequisite for good Republican rule. Another is that if the nation is to endure, it has to take into account the fact that this is a very large nation. And so how does republicanism as a political construct work in such a large country? It was the concern of many founders, because even at that early time in 1787, only 13 states, they were still much, much larger than any country in Europe. And the country, the United States as a whole, was much larger than the European continent. So how is that going to work? Because in the past, republics tended to be a lot smaller. Another founding idea is that in a republic, compromise and good leadership is absolutely essential. And I'll explain more about those things, but it should go without say that those two are key ingredients to making the republic work.
Rafaele, excuse me for interrupting. Can you just advance the slides as you're talking?
Oh, it's advanced in my end.
Okay. Not on our end here.
Okay. Let me then
now
try to do that.
Yep.
Okay. I'll keep it this way. That way it's easy for me to click. Thank you.
Okay.
Cindy.
Yep.
But the other part of republicanism is that it requires intergenerational attention. That's kind of a word I coined to describe the fact that it's not enough for one generation to set forth these ideals. What has to happen also is that those ideals have to be passed on to the next generation, and more importantly, embraced by the next generation. And if you sum up all of these founding principles, they require virtue. Virtue is kind of pervasive, ought to be pervasive in a Republican form of government. It's the glue that keeps the experiment intact. So one of the things that's very noticeable about the Founding Fathers is that they were devout students of history. They knew their history well, like the back of their hand, it's been said. And they knew the past examples of republicanism and whether they worked. And the first, of course, is ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And they took account of the fact that these were blueprints by which the United States ought to be modeled. But at the same time, Greece and Rome didn't last forever. In fact, the Roman Empire became the empire after centuries of being a republic, and then it collapsed shortly thereafter. And there was a lesson in that. The Italian city-states of the Renaissance in the 1400s were another case in point. They, as vibrant and robust as they were as political cultures where republicanism existed, they didn't last forever. And even 17th century England, that serves as the most contemporary example of republicanism, was engulfed in a civil war in the mid-17th century. And so republics were not guaranteed. And if anything, past history indicated that they didn't often succeed. So I think that's an important point to remember as well. What about the Republican experiment in 1787? Well, the founders understood, Madison especially, that if a republic is going to work, three things had to happen simultaneously. First is you need to get the people's consent. You need buy-in from the people, but you also need them to give consent to the governors, to those who govern. Without that legitimacy, a republic is bound to fail from the start. As Madison himself said, ultimate authority resides in the people alone, not in the king, not in God even, but the people must have that authority. And it's a very important central part of what republicanism is. Secondly, you have to keep the people's passions under control. While power and authority ought to reside in people, we must take care not to have the people overly passionate to the point where they lose a sense of reason. So there had to be, even in this vein, an emphasis on virtue, on what the founders called the public good. The eye always had to be kept on the public good. It gets back to Ben Franklin's statement, a republic, if you can keep it. And thirdly, you had to create a limited style government based on a system of checks and balances and a separation of powers. And the reason for that is because if you create a too powerful national government, that will devolve into autocracy. But if you create too weak of a national government, then the passions of the people will boil over and you're right back where you started. And this is one of my favorite quotations of Madison. He said it very succinctly: if men were angels, there would be no need for government. And that is absolutely right. You put a framework of government in place so that it would check people's emotions and passions as much as you are checking other political leaders, the political elite. So that was the reason behind a system of checks and balances. Now, the founders also understood when republics didn't work, what went into their failure. And one thing, of course, was the passions of people. If they overflow, it inevitably leads to mob rule. And mob rule is the opposite of republicanism. It's chaos, it's violence, it's bloodshed. And to contain mob rule when things overflowed, what happens is typically in the past, a dictator or a king, a monarch, someone takes over to contain those passions of the mob. And of course, the dictator, the king, that person is anti-democratic, anti-republican, is an authoritarian ruler. So the dictator imposes authoritarian rule, and before you know it, the republic has failed. And of course, as I said, history of republics is rife with examples of them dying. And that's what I try to convey to my students all the time. We have a sense that, looking back in our history, that the creation of the Constitution, the success of the Constitution was inevitable, but that was by no means guaranteed. The founders were not naive in thinking that this experiment could end badly. The founders were also concerned about republicanism in large countries. Many were worried about that, but not James Madison. He had a brilliant way of looking at it. In Federalist Number 10, Federalist Papers were a series of essays written by not just Madison, but also Alexander Hamilton, a few by John Jay. In Federalist 10, Madison argued that the size of the country was in fact an asset because it meant that competing interests would all cancel one another out. The country's so large that no one particular set of people can rule over all the others. If you look at it to this day, most of the violence that occurs in the world is a result of two competing factions of people, whether religious factions or political factions or ethnic factions, destroying one another. But in the United States, that was not possible because of the many, many religions that had to coexist, the many, many ethnic groups that had to coexist. And so Madison brilliantly conceived of the country as a place that is pluralistic and diverse. And from that idea is born the idea that America's diversity is its biggest strength. And I think he was right about that. That is why the Constitution has withstood the test of time. The next principle is that republics work with compromise and good leadership. And if you study the Constitutional Convention, you become very quickly aware of the fact that compromise was the order of the day. For instance, the Connecticut Compromise offered by Roger Sherman, one of the delegates to the convention, proposed a bicameral legislature. In other words, Congress would have two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and it would be two chambers so that no large set of states could gain power over the small states, and that the small states would not have a disproportionate amount of power compared to the larger states. This was a compromise between those who wanted a unicameral legislature and those who believed that a Congress should be made up of strictly representatives based on population. Another compromise was over representation in the House of Representatives. We know it as the 3/5 clause. It turns out to be a very infamous clause. The 3/5 clause gave 3/5 representation among blacks in America, slaves in America. So rather than counting the full population of blacks in each state, only 60% of that population would be counted. Why was there a compromise over this? Because Southern delegates found themselves in the rather uncomfortable position of saying blacks are people, they ought to be counted. For many, many years and decades, they had argued that blacks were not people but property. Now they reversed themselves. And Northern delegates called them on that. We don't want blacks now to count as people, the Northern delegates would say, if that would increase the Southern states' representation. What was the compromise? The 3/5 clause. Another compromise was how much power the national government should be given from this Constitution. Should states remain intact? Should they keep their own laws? So this issue of federalism is an example of compromise too. And finally, the very fact that the Bill of Rights was included in the draft of the Constitution that was eventually sent to the states was a product of compromise between these so-called Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And the compromise, the reasons for compromise was clear, because without them, you don't have a country. You'd have the Republican experiment end before it was even to begin. And so I think politicians today could learn a lesson or two from that ability to compromise. And of course, we cannot underestimate the leadership of George Washington, a necessary ingredient for the Republic to work. What Madison said of leaders in general is that the Republic needs an enlightened statesman who should always be at the helm, an enlightened statesman. And what was meant by enlightenment was very specific. That person had to have virtue. He had to rule in a sober-minded way. Well, all I need to do is give you the history of Washington to give you the epitome of that virtue. What is the lesson of Washington? Well, first of all, he was a hero of the Revolution. Without him, the revolutionary cause would have been in vain. I think that's quite clear. Soldiers were literally willing to die for him and the cause as well. He exuded leadership. Once he became president and he was selected unanimously, he used his veto power sparingly. Only when there was a clear violation of the Constitution was Washington willing to use his veto. And I think that's instructive for us today too, because you've probably heard of the word executive order time and again these days. It's become a kind of contagion among presidents to use that authority. Not so Washington. The most impressive thing I would say about Washington is that he gave up power willingly, not once, but at least twice. When he returned home from the revolution that was won, the last thing he wanted to do is enter into a career of politics. He just wanted to retreat back to his home in Mount Vernon, and he could retire serenely. But James Madison, once again, he begged Washington, you have to be at the Constitutional Convention. Without you, it will lack legitimacy. It will not have the authority. It will not command the respect that it would have with you there. So literally Madison begged him, and Washington gave in and attended the convention. Little is known about this of his role during the convention, but Washington did not speak very often. In fact, he only spoke about one time, and that was just on a procedural matter. Didn't say much of import. But the very fact that he was there, his mere presence alone was enough to give that convention legitimacy. And the reason I mention the fact that he didn't speak often is that he was one of those political leaders in his infinite wisdom who didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened to him. He didn't bloviate, as I like to say. It's kind of like the opposite of some politicians today, and I won't name names, but it seems like the more they speak, the less they say. Washington, he spoke seldom, but said a lot. And I think that proves to be crucial in keeping the republic going in the first generation. What about that intergenerational attention? Well, the founders were very keen on this idea. It's written right in the preamble to the Constitution. You form a more perfect union, not just for ourselves, the founding generation, but for posterity as well. So this Constitution was meant to be not just for their time, but for all time. And what's most interesting to me is that the generation that followed the founders, they embraced this concept wholeheartedly. The pre-Civil War era was made up of reformers, joiners of civic organizations and associations. The French visitor to the United States in the 1830s observed this very quickly. He was so impressed with the fact that Americans loved to join civic associations for a cause, for any cause, whether it was temperance of alcohol, whether it was women's rights, abolition of slavery, you name it, there was a civic association in its name, because the reformers of the antebellum period understood that in order for the republic to be kept, you had to become proactive at the local level, at the civic level. Without that, there's no point in discussing what happens in the national leadership. And during that generation, very early on in the 1830s, Lincoln was very well aware of those civic associations, but he was also aware of that ever-present potential for the passions of the people spilling out into the streets. He called it King Mob, and he referred to the mobocracy as a potential danger for republics. Lincoln, in his infinite wisdom, was the epitome of compromise as well. And I think that served him and the country very well during the Civil War. So to ensure success through the ages, how do you acquire this sense of republicanism? Well, you've got to be educated on it. You could argue that the generation that followed the founders was the most educated in American history. Here you have the rise of public education in the United States, starting with Massachusetts, but then extending virtually everywhere. You have people like Horace Mann and Lydia Maria Child, reformers themselves, who prided themselves on instructing young people that they must be taught not just about math, about Latin, but also about civics, the history of the country, government structure, why it's important. There was a concept during this time that was called Republican motherhood, that mothers had to instruct their children well. Today, of course, we call this a civic education. But back then, there wasn't really a name for it because it was just kind of embedded in the culture of America. It was like the air we breathe. Didn't need a name. You just did it because it was instinctual to have to instruct the younger generation on the benefits of Republican government. So to link the past with the present, where do we stand today? Is this noble experiment working? Or have the passions of the people spilled into the streets? Have they been kept in check? Have we, in some sense, turned toward authoritarianism? And maybe more specifically, speaking to that photo of Madison, what impact has social media had on our constitutional system? What about the size of the country? The founders were concerned about the landmass that was the United States at the time. But we've grown exponentially since then. We are now a nation of about 340 million people. There were just under 4 million in 1787. Is it possible to maintain a republican form of government in such a large nation of people? And certainly today, those people are examples of the competing, but also the contradictory and conflicting interests. Today we have a north-south divide, but not only that, we have an elite common people divide. We have a East Coast, West Coast divide against the interior, and a whole other set of divisions that we seem to be plagued by and consumed with. How do we overcome these in such a large country? And what about the art of compromise? There's clearly, studies indicate this over and over again, heightened polarization in this country, not among the political elite alone, but in everyday parlance as well. You see it at the local, the state, and the national levels. There's this inability to compromise. There are loud voices on all political fronts, but it's the extremes who are the loudest. And it's been said to me many times, and I think this is right, we seem to be losing the middle. And it's in the middle where compromise is possible. It's in the middle where good, solid leadership grows. And the byproduct of all that is a loss of trust in institutions. And we see clear examples of that in a poll that's been taken over the last decade or so, when Americans are asked if they approve of the job Congress is doing, for instance. And Congress is the most important body, you could argue, in a Republican government because it represents the pulse of the people. But that poll indicates something like 14%, 15%, 16% of the American people approve of the job Congress is doing. When Americans are asked whether they trust the presidency, not just the president, but the presidency, a majority say no. When they trust members of Congress, they say no. What about the Supreme Court? Same thing. So you see the decline in trust across the board. So clearly there are things to be concerned about there. And what about our intergenerational commitment? Have we been able to pass on the tradition of republicanism? There's certainly a decline in devotion to civics and civic mindedness in this country. I think it's pretty clear. It seems like civics classes in high school or grade school are not requirements anymore. And there's just this kind of passing thought given to them rather than to have students embrace civic mindedness. Robert Putnam, famous sociologist, has lamented the fact that the civic association memberships in this country have declined precipitously. This is a trend that started after World War II, but they have picked up even more of late, especially in the 21st century. So where does that fit into the grand scheme of Republican values? There's also, I noticed, a lack of reverence for the founding generation. I think it's pretty obvious that if you look at the narrative today, that the founders were slave owners, that they were against women. The founders were misogynists. They didn't like average people. Now, that is true on some level, beyond dispute, you could say. But at the same time, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some ideals that were just brilliant that they communicated to the American people. And despite their flaws, and who among us doesn't have flaws, I think we should revere them. And knocking down their statues, I don't think is an answer to our current problems. And it's just my 2 cents on it. But I think that's just a very harmful, kind of toxic thing that we have noticed as a trend. I think there's also a lack of reverence for American history. The fact is that it's not studied as much anymore. And if it is, any old person, anybody off the street can say what they want on a blog. They can communicate on a website, whatever they want. And so history today is filled with misinformation, disinformation. It's filled with a lot of things that are inaccurate. And I think that speaks to the lack of reverence of American history. And of course, the effects of social media have been written about. It's now being studied. There are lots more studies have come out that say there's a lot of polarization and disinformation sparked by social media. You could argue that there is what you might call digital mob rule on Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media site you want to name. Lots of conflict happening there for sure. And so as a result, there's less trust among people at the local, state, and national levels. So are we doomed? I guess that's the question, considering what I just said. And my answer to that is no, I don't think so. As dire as things may seem, we're not doomed, but here's what I believe needs to happen. First of all, we need a recommitment to civic education. And that starts in the family, just like the reformers of the 1830s and 40s understood. But that needs to extend into the school system, and not just at 7th grade, 8th grade physics classes or 9th grade physics, K through college. It needs to be embedded in the educational culture of our institutions. E.D. Hirsch is a very famous commentator on this. He wrote a book called The Making of Americans, in which he really spells out that teaching civics is like teaching a language. The younger you are, the more you embrace it. And the more you repeat it through the grades, the more that people inculcate it into their ideas, into their way of living. So a civic education would lead, in Madison's words, to cool and deliberate sense of community, the opposite of mob rule. There ought to be an emphasis also on local government. Local government is the government that's closest to us. And it's there that I think we rediscover what republicanism actually means. We ought to reclaim the idea of civic associations and how important they are, not only to the nation's present, but to its past. It's part of America's tradition, unlike most other countries of the world. There are also new movements afoot, like regionalism, that the country, because it's so large, maybe it ought to be unofficially divided into regions where each region takes control of its own destiny, where a kind of local republicanism is practiced. These are ideas and they're important, but I do think it starts with education. So if we are able to recommit to those kinds of things, I think we do have a chance to get out of our current predicament. And in that case, I think you'd have a happy Madison rather than someone looking depressed into an iPhone. And you'd have a happy republic as a result. Thank you very much for listening to me. I welcome your questions. And why don't we begin with the questions and comments?
So thank you so much, Rafaele. That was very interesting. And I do have a question from our very own Ann Guernsey. And she says, thanks for this overview. What role do you think museums like WDS play in promoting civics in light of changes in educational standards, which you kind of touched on, in your last few slides?
Right. Well, I think museums play an invaluable role because, to me, the way I look at it, they're an extension of the educational apparatus of the country. Without museums, you don't have this presentation is evidence of that. There are artifacts in museums that can speak to our past, and the very fact that we honor the founders in museums like yours suggests that they have a role to play. What I would say also, though, is I think that school systems need to do a better job of bringing young people to these museums. It's not enough to have them there, but schools need to play a more active role in getting students to appreciate museums and getting them to participate in what museums have to offer. I just don't think there's enough of that now. I lived in Wethersfield for a time, and I know that Wethersfield has a very active student body and is connected to the Silas Deane Museum and others in town, but I don't think that happens across the board. There's a museum in New Britain, and most of my students come from New Britain, and they've never heard of it. And I think that's a basic problem, and it speaks to the larger issue of the fact that school systems, the public schools in particular, are just not doing enough to make that connection. So they have an invaluable role to play, but it's up to educators to make sure that happens.
Yep, absolutely. And COVID, certainly put a clamp down on a lot of our in-person visits.
Absolutely.
So, Another comment, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
another comment, thank you. Can we please see that first photo you shared?
The first photo, the one
Yes,
with
the
Madison
cell
crying.
phone.
I love it too. It's
Yeah,
just it's such a telling, revealing photo.
yeah. And another question just came in. In your view, has the federal government outgrown the role the founders intended for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in my American government course, we talk about this a lot. It's one of the themes, and I think to some extent, yes. And I can talk forever about this issue, but it's kind of a double-edged sword because in theory, you would love for states to reclaim a lot of their power, and in some sense, they have. But if you look at the long history of Americans, 240 years, what you've seen is the federal government's power increase year in and year out, decade after decade. And we see all kinds of examples of that. I mentioned executive authority earlier. One clear indication of how much power the federal government has is what the president can do today versus what he could do in Washington's time. And I think this is a very, very dangerous trend constitutionally. Since World War II, there has not been one declaration of war that Congress has given the president. The last time someone got an official declaration of war was Franklin Roosevelt. And those wars may have been justified or not. We can debate that. There's no debating the fact that only Congress has the power to declare war. And when I explain that to my students, I tell them this from two perspectives. On the one hand, the president has grabbed this power, but on the other hand, Congress has given him that power. And Congress would do well to reclaim that power. So it's not just states reclaiming their power. Congress has to do that because it always, in a Republican form of government, Congress represents the people. That's where the people give consent. Also, I kind of hinted at it in my presentation, but the number of executive orders that presidents have given recently, and both parties do this, has hit record highs. And I also talk to my students about this. I will give an example of an executive order a president has issued that I know students would be in favor of. And they all raise their hand, yeah, that was a good thing. But then I make the point, well, what happens when there's a new president who just follows that precedent and issues his own executive order that you don't like? So if you don't like it sometimes, and sometimes you do like it, it's the principle that's the problem. And I think one of the other issues about executive orders is that the Congress is just not doing its job responsibly. If it did, there would be fewer needs for executive orders. So that's just one example of how the federal government has assumed way too much power. The other is in the federal bureaucracy. I mean, in Washington's time, he had a Secretary of War, he had a Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, not much else. That was his cabinet. Now we have not just many, many more cabinet members, but underlings who work for them. That consists of dozens upon dozens of people. We have departments in the federal government, the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, the Department of Homeland Security. We have hundreds of thousands of people in our federal bureaucracy, and none of them are elected officials. And yet they're the ones on a day-to-day basis who are making the decisions on behalf of this country. And I think that is a very dangerous trend. That may be the biggest threat to democracy. That we should have discussions about at the very least. And another reason to return politics to the local level to kind of circumvent the problem of this growing bureaucracy. So those are just a couple of examples, but there are more for sure.
So we have time for one more, and I'm going to pick this one because it's very relevant. Would you please comment on the January 6th events from the standpoint of an historian?
I thought that was going to come up at some point. Well, to me, it's kind of the clearest example of the passions of the people. It's not so much a cause of anything as it is a symptom of where we are. And the symptom of it is that, you know, when we don't have the virtue that we need to have, the sober-minded thinking, the ability to compromise, then the extreme voices take hold. And what you saw in January 6th are those extreme voices taking hold of the government, literally. And I think that is the worst thing about January 6th, without indicting specific people who were part of it. It's just this mentality that anything goes. Any political party, any person with any political persuasion could have been part of that. In fact, there are all sorts of protests that happen in the streets of America that kind of hint at the same thing. It's not just January 6th. I think the knee-jerk reaction of most Americans today is to not necessarily take to the streets, but get into groups of like-minded people who think like you do and act like you do, and criticize everybody else, indict everyone else, troll everyone else if we're talking about social media. Just one quick example, I hope I have time, but in Farmington, we had a battle over the last couple of years over whether we should build a new high school. And instead of having good, solid debate face to face in the town hall, what we did instead is lots of people resorted to Facebook and had their debate there, and it turned ugly real fast, to the point where people who knew each other, respected each other, were calling each other names. They were trolling one another, and it was just an ugly scene. So it's not just happening at the national level, but we kind of all have our own January 6th, digitally speaking. That, I think, is one thing I would propose, the kind of de-emphasis of social media. It's really hurting us.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of the museum and the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of Connecticut, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Rafaele for a wonderful presentation. I feel like we could have just kept going on this. If you enjoyed this program, please consider donating to the museum at wdsmuseum.org to help us continue to offer free and affordable community events. Join us for our next week serving up history when Hartford was a retail hub, the growth of the city's great department stores, 1890s through the 1960s. That is on February 23rd. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.